Well, we are jumping back into our Revelation series, and we will engage in a bit of review this morning simply because it has been a while since we've been in this. That's okay. We had some other stuff to take care of. We're in what is called After These Things, or the portion of the text that really begins around chapter 4, but what we're focused on sections 6 through 22. And to hone in a bit more than that, we've been in what we call a parenthesis, or the parenthetical chapters, which are chapter 10 through 14, because they represent kind of a pause in the action. Last time, we were really taking a look at Revelation chapter 12, which was the greatest summary of the entire biblical plot contained anywhere in the book. It really goes from the story from Genesis to the end in one chapter, as long as you know how to interpret it correctly. So we covered those. Your homework for the past couple of weeks has been to read Revelation chapter 13, which introduces Satan's dynamic duo, the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth, and to consider as background information the origin of Satan as discussed in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. This topic of this guy called the Assyrian, we see him show up in Isaiah 10:24, Micah 5:5, and then this beast's physical description, Zechariah 11 through 17. So those were the places we wanted you to hang out. And just real briefly, to kind of clue you back into where we are in the book, after we completed our examination of the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, chapters 4 and 5 introduced a 7-sealed scroll. Chapter 6 began the opening of these scrolls, and it really dealt with the first 4 or so of those, first 6 basically of those seals, and the first 4 are known as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The other 2, they all kind of factor into what we call the beginning of sorrows, which is a term Jesus used in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and in Luke 21. But then we saw there was a gap between the 6th and the 7th seal, which was chapter 7, and that gap was a parenthetical chapter, just a pause, just a brief moment to catch your breath and talk about something else before the 7th seal began to start with the 7 trumpets in chapters 8 and 9, the first 4 of which are in chapter 8, next 2 are in chapter 9, and then we hit this next parenthesis of chapters 10 through 14 before the 7th trumpet actually blows. There's a verse in chapter 11 that says the 7th trumpet is about to blow, but it doesn't actually start taking place until chapter 15, and the 7th trumpet is also known as the 7 bowl judgments. And even in that, we will see a little 1-verse parenthesis between the 6th and the 7th trumpet. It's just how the book is laid out. So, we've been looking at the rapture, or the harpazo, taking place. The church is out of here. Revelation 4, verse 1. After these things, we find the lampstands that were on earth in chapters 2 and 3, in heaven in chapter 4. And then those 6 seals are the beginning of sorrows. And some people say that that's the beginning of that 70th week of Daniel, that tribulation period. But there really could be a gap there. And we discussed that maybe Jesus says those first signs are in fact non-signs. They haven't started things yet. So we consider that a gap. Then while we're in heaven enjoying the Bema Seat judgment and the rewards of the righteous believers and the marriage supper of the Lamb, this beast that we're going to talk about in the next couple of sessions arrives on the scene. The last 7 weeks of Daniel's 70-week prophecy from Daniel 9 begin to take place. There'll be a 3.5-year period of false peace. There'll be an abomination of desolation where an idol is erected in the Holy of Holies of the new temple at the midpoint. And then there will be 3.5 years of God's wrath being poured out. We haven't quite gotten there yet. So I think that's about enough review because we do have so much to cover. So let's begin to talk now about the two beasts of Revelation 13. As we saw, starting in chapter 12, chapters 12 and 13 bring the reader across 7 characters or 7 personages, 7 identities that exist in the text. In chapter 12, we saw the woman and the man-child and the great red dragon. Then in we also saw Michael the archangel, and the Lamb of God is going to be represented to us shortly. But in chapter 13, we're specifically going to focus on the 7-headed beast of the sea and the false prophet beast of the earth. So let's look at the outline of the chapter. We'll be spending the next session or two in. In verses 1 through 3 of chapter 13, you'll see the description of the sea beast. In verses 4 through 8, you'll see the worship of the sea beast described in detail. In verses 9 through 10, you'll see a dire warning, kind of a pause in the action that warns those that have ears to hear. Then in verse 11, we will see a description of the land beast. Verse 12 through 15, we will see the function and the abilities of the land beast. Verses 16 through 17, we will come up to a topic that anybody who doesn't know anything about Revelation, except for this one thing they know, which is the mark of the beast, that creepy mark of the beast. And I'm just going to go ahead and pop everybody's bubble right now. It's not the COVID-19 vaccine. Okay? Verse 18, we will also see the number of the beast. And we're going to spend some time looking at what the Bible tells us about the identity of the beast as we get to the last verses of this chapter. So obviously, the first thing on deck is to look at the beast from the sea. And we'll dive into Revelation 13, verse 1. It says, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name." So, as we hinted at, there is manuscript evidence that suggests that this first verse of chapter 13 is actually, in some texts, the last verse of chapter 12, which is perfectly fine because the verses weren't added to the text until centuries after Christ and the early church and all that kind of stuff. The point that I even bring that up is to say the vision of the last chapter is not over. This is a continuation of what we've been experiencing up until this point. Does that make sense? Okay? So don't make the mistake of jumping in and reading one chapter and trying to find specifically its context without knowing what's around it. Now, it's also important to realize that this is John who's standing. Some people translate this that the beast was standing. No, John is standing on the sand of the sea, and he sees this beast rising up out of the sea. And the word here in Greek is therion versus like the word zoa. Therion is a word that conveys a meaning of a beast of prey. This is a predator, so to speak, okay? Not a nice beast, not a good beast. The word sea here, and we're going to create some distinctives for you as we go. What does it mean? Why does the Bible take the time to point out that one of these beasts comes from the sea and one of these beasts come from the land? Why is that important? Well, used literally, this word, thalassa, is of the sea, or the great sea in the Bible. Whenever you see that phrase, the great sea in the Bible, that is the Mediterranean Sea. It's not one of the oceans. The biggest sea in the biblical world was the Mediterranean Sea, because from Israel's standpoint, you got the Sea of Galilee on the east and the Jordan River, and on the other side, you've got the Mediterranean Sea, and that's much bigger, so that's the Great Sea. That's the biblical worldview, okay? The Atlantic, the Pacific, they're not even in sight. That is beyond the reach of what they see. So we see it used specifically as the sea in general, or the Mediterranean Sea. Sometimes even the Red Sea in the south of Israel will be shown there. But is there another meaning if we look at this from a prophetic standpoint? In Revelation 17:15, kind of flashing forward a little bit, it says, "Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits," yes, there's yet another character we're going to learn about, a character who rides upon the beast, by the way. "The waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." So we know, not that we're putting it there, but that the text itself is putting a metaphorical or a symbolic meaning on the sea. Does that make sense? We don't got to read something into it if the text is already giving it to us. So the harlot sits on many waters, and we're told that these represent multitude, nations, and tongues. And Isaiah 57:20 through 21 says, "But the wicked are like the troubled sea, when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked." So for the nations of the world, multitudes, nations, tribes, tongues, if that is not a peaceful sea, but a tumultuous sea, it is a sea that represents that there is no peace at the time of this visit. We're seeing this beast rise up out of a tumultuous group of nations that is lacking peace. Do you get the picture? Okay. So the fact that the sea represents foreign nations is not just limited to the Bible. This meaning is also found in extra-biblical Hebrew texts like the Talmud and the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Talmud, foreign nations are literally called provinces of the sea. And hymn 7 of the Dead Sea Scrolls depicts a foreign besieging army in flood or water imagery. So I want to flash us back to a moment to some imagery we saw back in Revelations 4 and 5, because an interesting picture emerges if the church is in view in heaven in Revelation 4 and 5, as we have said, because we see Jesus in Matthew chapter 14, 22 through 36, or Mark 6, 45 through 56, or John 6, 16 through 24. We see Jesus walking calmly on the water during a stormy, tumultuous sea. He just walks right over it. In fact, Peter, once he gets over his fear that Jesus is possibly a ghost and decides not to call the Ghostbusters, says, "If it's really you, God, call me and I'll come to you." And amazingly, he walks on water until he takes his eyes off of Christ, right? The sea that we see near the 24 elders, which can only be the church because they're kings and priests, the sea that we see in Revelation 4 in heaven is what? It's solidified. It's crystal. Meaning that all the inhabitants of the heavenly throne room can walk upon those waters without having to fear sinking. It has changed. So while the church is in heaven, the sea is already at peace, but the waters on the earth are troubled. Now, one of the things that makes us beg the question is this sea, in respect to biblical prophecy, has to do with Gentile nations. So does that mean that this beast of the sea is a Gentile? Because the sea is not Israel? Does this suggest that this coming world dictator, this beast of the sea, rises from the troubled waters of the Gentile nations to bring false peace to the stormy waters the world is looking at? That seems to be the imagery the Bible is putting in front of us. Now, with that said, it'll be helpful, and we did this in our series on the Antichrist in greater detail than we'll do here this morning, but it'll be helpful to look at the four beasts of Daniel 7. And because I know most of you probably didn't memorize everything I said in that series on the Antichrist, I figured we'd review it a little bit. So we see four beasts: the lion that had eagle's wings, the bear tipped up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth, the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, and then a different beast, terrible, iron teeth, bronze nails, 10 horns, and then an 11th horn that has a face and a mouth like a man. Let's flash back and read some of Daniel 7, just for comparison. Starting in verse 2, it says, Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. So we know we have metaphorical or prophetic meaning behind that term, but what else is the great sea? It's the Mediterranean Sea, right? So 2 layers of meaning already. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Now, prophetically speaking, he's having a vision of 4 world empires, and the first of these empires is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is the empire that conquered the Assyrians, and the king of that empire in that moment was Nebuchadnezzar, right? And we know that King Nebuchadnezzar, he was a beast, Daniel chapter 4, made to stand on 2 legs, and a new heart was given to him, right? Interesting, yeah? Okay? So the first beast that we see is the winged lion. The lion had wings like an eagle. And in fact, in the British Museum today, there is a gate of Babylon that has a winged lion on it. So we have evidence that even Babylon itself had imagery of the winged lion in its own culture. So most scholars have no problem interpreting that first beast as the empire of Babylon. Moving on. And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. Well, starting under Xerxes, the Medo-Persian Empire conquered Babylon. And that was an affiliation of 2 nations, right? The Medes and the Persians. So the second beast is the strong but unbalanced bear, raised up on one side. In other words, off kilter a little bit. The bear is less regal, but has formidable strength. Xerxes was said to have an army of 2.5 million men. Daniel 8:3 relates 2 horns here, but it was a one-sided union. In other words, Media was already swallowed up by Persia by 550 BC. So what started out as an unbalanced union, one side took over the other side historically. Then, 3 ribs in its mouth. Well, Persia defeated Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. And you can see more about this in Isaiah 13, 17 through 18. Now, it's also interesting that symbolically here, David triumphs over a lion and a bear in his young days before he becomes king and takes on Goliath, right? And Proverbs 28:15 compares a wicked ruler to a roaring lion and a charging bear. So we can even see God winds up using the same symbolism other places in the text, and we can elucidate our reading. We can illuminate our understanding by digging deeper at times in these places. So far we've got a winged lion and a strong but unbalanced bear, and we can even see the historical import that is taking place in Daniel's life as this vision is walked out. Daniel 7:6 says, After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Well, the empire that succeeded the Persian Empire was the Greek Empire at the reigns of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great wept because he had no more lands to conquer. And when he was on his deathbed, they said, To whom shall the kingdom go? And instead of appointing a successor, he just said, Let it go to the strong. Well, of course, this did not bode well for the rest of the empire. And his 4 generals Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus, they divided up the empire into 4 territories, which gives us the 4 heads of the great leopard. And specifically in the Bible, Ptolemy and Seleucus, they were on either side, basically north and south of Israel. Israel right in the middle there where I have those arrows pointing. And so they became, in biblical terms, the king of the north and the king of the south. And people say that there are 400 silent years that the Bible doesn't talk about. That's not true. They're detailed in advance in Daniel chapter 11, where God prophetically gives insights into all of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kings that would reign from the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire taking over. All of those things that happen are detailed, especially starting in Daniel 11, 5 through 35. We see that breakdown between Seleucus and Ptolemy in all of their wars. And we see the Ptolemies become the king of the south, the Seleucids become the king of the north. They're all named, they're all described in Daniel chapter 11, detailed in advance, so much so that scholars think Daniel had to be written later because 400 years of prophecy or of history are recorded for us before they ever happened in one chapter of the Bible. That's what Daniel chapter 11 is. So the third beast is the 4-headed leopard. 4 wings of a bird, dominion given to it. Cassander takes Greece and Macedonia, Lysimachus, Thrace and Bithynia, Seleucus, Syria and Babylonia, Ptolemy, Egypt, Palestine, Arabia, Petrea. So what's interesting here is so far we see a composite of 3 animals. In fact, I'll go to Hosea 13, verse 5. It says, I knew you in the wilderness, in the land of great drought. When they had pasture, they were filled, and their heart was exalted. Therefore they forgot me. So I will be to them like a lion, like a leopard. By the roar I will lurk. I will meet them like a bear, deprived of her cubs. I will tear open their rib cage, and there I will devour them like a lion. Finally it says, the wild beast shall tear them. Now, of course, most people look at that and they think, well, the lion, the leopard, the bear, those all seem like wild beasts to me. Notice, it is God saying he will be like them to Israel in his judgments for their sin. But no, that wild beast isn't just a catch-all for the first 3. According to Daniel 7, 1 beast remains. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. This beast has no animal comparison. Check my notes here. No animal comparison. It's trampling all underfoot. So here we see the Roman Empire, the greatest empire, the empire that is ruling when John is writing the book of Revelation. They occupy Sicily in 241 BC. The Mediterranean becomes a Roman lake by the beginning of the 2nd century BC. Spain is conquered first, then Carthage at the Battle of Zama in North Africa in 202 BC. They subjugate the north of Italy. Then they moved east, conquering Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor. Pompey swept into Jerusalem in 63 BC after destroying the remnants of the Seleucid Empire in Syria. In the following decades, the empire controls southern Britain, France, Belgium, Switzerland, and Germany, west of the Rhine River, and it grew for 4 centuries, peaking in AD 117. But it started to slowly decline. Beginning in the 3rd century, they left Britain in AD 407, and Rome started being sacked by the Visigoths in 410. But it wasn't all the way until 1453, about 600 years ago, that the last Roman or Byzantine ruler was killed in a battle with Muhammad II, and Constantinople, the other capital of Rome, was conquered. And people forget this. They think Rome ended in the 400s. Well, no, only half of the Roman Empire ended in the 400s, because the eastern half, where Constantine moved the capital from Rome to a city called Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople, which today is Istanbul. Okay? No, I'm not going to sing the song. And he started a whole nother leg. Well, what do you mean leg? Well, if you remember, Daniel chapter 2 was a vision of a statue, and it had succeeding nations. The head of gold was Babylon. Persia was silver. Brass was Greece. And then Rome was the legs. So you have two legs. And isn't it amazing that historically, in Daniel's time, the last of these empires is broken into two legs? The western and the eastern. And the last portion of that empire said iron and clay. And most commentators suggest that the 10-nation confederacy that this final beast is going to come out of is going to be some part of Rome version 2.0. I suggest that might be a little bit myopic. I suggest that for the following reason. Daniel 2:43 says, "And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with the ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay." Who mingles with the seed of men if you're not men? Who's they? Because last I checked, the seed of men's all we got. Again, I hint at this because as you see, as we work our way towards some very key verses in Revelation 17, I personally find issue with the most traditional commentators' view that keep things very, very human in the tribulation time period. We have hints that there is something far more sinister happening, and it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 6. This is one of those hints. The Bible very coyly, cryptically, says they mix with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to them. That's creepy stuff. Who's they? I don't have time to get there. Hang on, we're going to get there. Back in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, it says, "I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words." So this becomes the title of this coming world ruler. He is the little horn, or as I like to call him, Mr. Big Mouth. And this idiom shows up again and again and again. We see it in Revelation 13. That's why I'm backing up to show you this. He's always speaking pompous, blasphemous words. And one king, one of those kings of the north, kings of the south, one king is used during that 400-year period as a prototype or an antitype of the coming world ruler. And that's this man, Antiochus Epiphanes. He is the one who erected the first abomination of desolation, putting an idol in the Holy of Holies and slaughtering a pig upon the altar, which led to the Maccabean revolt, which gave Israel control of its own territories for a very brief period of time after a bloody war before the Romans reconquered them. Okay? So this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, he becomes a antitype of the Antichrist. He becomes a foreshadow that Jesus himself even points to for how despicable he was, because he saw himself as a god. Daniel 7:19. Skipping ahead, it says, Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured broken pieces and trampled the residue with its feet. Daniel shows no interest in the first three beasts whatsoever. That seems totally normal to him. But this last beast bothers him. He says, And then the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. He said, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints, and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. So it came after the 10 horns were in existence and then was contemporaneous with them. It uproots 3 of the 10 horns, or kings. He was intelligent. It had the eyes of a man. It was arrogant and boastful. But now some additional facts are given. He will prevail against the saints of the Most High. He will overcome them. We even see this again in Revelation 13, verse 7. But this would appear to contradict what Jesus says as a promise to the church in Matthew 16:18, where he says, Upon this rock, Peter, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So we're forced to come to the conclusion that not all saints are members of the church. There are Old Testament saints, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, David, and there are New Testament saints, the members of the church. And as we saw in Revelation chapter 7, there are 144,000 saints sealed in the tribulation period, and a great revival that takes place after that. So there are what are known as tribulation saints. Those saints are said to have to persevere to the end to be saved. But the church will not be prevailed against. Why? Because we're out of here. But the tribulation saints are repeatedly and often described as being tread upon, prevailed upon, killed, martyred. Verse 23 of Daniel 7 says, Thus he said, The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and trample it, and break it in pieces. So yes, Rome is in view, but is more in view. Verse 24, the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall rise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. The sphere of this coming ruler will be the fourth kingdom. It will be worldwide. Daniel was told that this empire would devour the whole earth. And it will be a ferocious conquest in which that kingdom will trample and crush those who oppose it, a coming one world government under a worldwide dictator. Daniel 7:25 says, And he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. And then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. And here we have one of those references to that last 3.5-year period that is known as the Great Tribulation. The quote-unquote Roman Empire will cease to exist when the little horn is judged. He will oppose God's authority. He will speak against the Most High. He will oppress his saints, i.e. Israel, and he will introduce an entirely new era in which he will abandon all previous laws and institute his own system. As in Daniel 9:27, he will appear as Israel's friend, will become Israel's persecutor, and he will occupy Jerusalem as a tabernacle of his empire for 3.5 years. Wrapping up where we want to read in Daniel, verses 26 and 27 says, But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, and the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. All right, with that understanding, let's jump back into Revelation 13:12. It says, "Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and his authority." So what do we know about this beast of the sea? Well, if you think about it, the lion communicates arrogantly, the bear controls extensively, and the leopard conquers swiftly. The beast of Daniel 7 is here represented in Revelation 13, but in reverse order. This beast, unlike any beast that has come before it, comprises or is of attributes of all the empires that came before. That is going to be critical when we get to Revelation 17. Because there are commentators out there right now that are trying to make exclusive allusions to a specific empire, because a specific empire represents a specific religion, and that specific religion is the mother of all terror in our world today. Therefore, the belief is that said Antichrist must come from that. Very popular. A lot of teachers, a lot of pastors jumping on that bandwagon. They love it because they say the Antichrist is going to go around chopping people's heads off, therefore he must be a Muslim. I'm going to contest that view, even though it's popular right now. So the beast receives his power from the great dragon of chapter 12. He has 7 heads and 10 crowns, diadems. These are not Stephanos reward crowns. These are crowns of authority. And what is important that we are going to see when we get to Revelation 17, verse 11, is that he is of the 7. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to flash forward. I didn't plan on doing that in this session, but I can see we're taking a little bit longer to get through some things. So I just want to flash forward to a different slide here. But Satan has 7 super kingdoms as far as the Bible is concerned. 7 empires: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome 1, and Rome 2. And by Rome 1 and Rome 2, I don't mean the western and the eastern legs. Those are both Rome 1. Rome 2 is just a quote-unquote name that we would put under everything else. What is coming? One of the things that people like to say right now is that, according to Revelation 17:11, it says, "The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition." Certain commentators quote the verse wrong and say, "and is of the 7th." And even though they have PhDs after their name, they can't tell the difference between ordinal and cardinal numbers in the Greek. It's not hard. I can do it. It doesn't say of the 7th, meaning of the 7th empire. It says of the 7, meaning whatever this final 8th empire is, it must have something in common with all of the 7. And that's what we're going to base our contesting of current trends on when we get to chapter 17. And it's going to lead us right back to Genesis chapter 6. It's going to lead us right back to that verse in Daniel chapter 2. We're not there yet. Get there. But that is an important distinction. Let's learn a little bit more about this beast of the sea. Verse 3 says, "And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast." Now this is critical. Because remember, the first allusion we saw to this character was at the opening of the seals. And the opening of the seals, going all the way back to Revelation 6, was the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You with me? And that first horseman is the white horse. And I told you back then that many commentators confuse that first rider with Christ because Christ rides a white horse. But I said, if this is Jesus, he's keeping bad company. You with me? This first rider was a rider of deception. And one of the things that Revelation 13 is telling us is that this rider, this first beast that we see, is going to suffer a mortal wound, a deadly wound, and be healed from it. Does this character appear to be resurrected from the dead? Does that give him a claim to messiahship? Our only physical description of this individual is in Zechariah 11:17 that says, "Woe to the worthless shepherd." Now that's the New King James Version, but the word in Hebrew actually is the idle shepherd. Do not confuse the words, not I-D-L-E as in doing nothing or lazy shepherd, I-D-O-L, idol, as in false god, false deity, shepherd. Who leaves the flock. A sword shall be against his arm and against his right eye. His arm shall completely wither, and his right eye shall be totally blinded. This begs the question, was he at one time Jewish but is no longer Jewish? He left the flock. Does he rise out of Gentile nations and return to Israel falsely as their potential Messiah? Is this why they receive him when he ushers in 3.5 years of peace? Is the reason that people take the mark, we will see at the end of this chapter, on their forehead or on their right hand, because it is an identification with the fact that he has a wound upon his head and his other hand is shriveled? Does he say, look at the wounds and see, to the doubting Thomases of his day? Is he a Jew but not a Jew, the same way that Herod claimed to be a Jew but was really an Idumean? Is this really the synagogue of Satan that Revelation 2 and 3 was talking about? More on this when we examine the second beast. It says, so they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? And who is able to make war with him? They worshiped this guy. Verse 5, and he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for how long? 42 months. The same amount of time as time, and half a time, or 1,260 days. 3.5 years. So you can see that what Daniel saw and that beast he was concerned with, even though Rome came later, there was an element of what came next that still concerned him deeply. The first 3, no problem, but something worse was coming in the last one. Something that even in John's day hadn't come yet. See what I'm saying? John 5:43 says, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. Speaking to Israel. If another comes in his own name, him you will receive. And I taught you guys this a while back. There's 2 words for another in Greek. One, zalos, the other is heteros. One means another of the same kind. The other means another of a different kind. And this very much is the word that says another of a different kind. Another not the same as me will come in his own name. Revelation 13:6 says, then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme God's name, God's tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. Why would he want to blaspheme those who... Why on earth is it necessary to blaspheme those who dwell in heaven? If the world is looking for answer to where billions of people disappeared to, might it not make sense while trying to bring peace to the troubled waters that you come up with a false story about those who vanished? Make sense? Thessalonians 2, 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 4 says, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day, or the day of the Lord, will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Revelation 13:7 says, "It was granted to him to make war with the saints and overcome them." Wait, I thought the church wasn't going to be overcome. Yeah, he's talking bad about the church. The church is dwelling in heaven. The saints that he's overcoming are the saints we were introduced to in Revelation chapter 7. "And authority was given to him over every tribe, tongue, and nation." And as I said to you before, Matthew 16:18 says, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." In fact, remember that gates are not an offensive weapon. Gates are a defensive structure. When Jesus was describing the church he would build, it was something that was going to offensively attack Hades and kick the enemy's butt, trample on snakes and scorpions. That is a far cry different than serpents and beasts that are given authority over saints for a period of time. I do not know about you, my friends, but I would rather be the one in authority than the one under the authority of someone who seeks to tread me down, claw me down, eat me, destroy me, trample me. Amen? Better to get on the bus now. Almost done with this segment. Matthew 11:11 through 13 says, "Assuredly I say to you, among those born of women, there was not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and law prophesied until John." Why do I include that scripture? As I said, all saints are not necessarily the church. Where does the Old Testament end and the New Testament begin? It's not that dividing page between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. It is the death of John the Baptist, because Jesus considered John the Baptist the greatest of all the Old Testament prophets. John the Baptist, living while Jesus was alive, was the greatest of the Old Testament prophets. But he says that even he who is the least in the church, in the kingdom of heaven, is greater than John the Baptist. The church is pictured as returning with Christ when he sets foot on the Mount of Olives to enact his war campaign of judgment from Petra back to Israel. When the blood is as high as the horse's bridle, the church is with Christ. We conquer, we rule, we reign. Know you not, you will judge angels. And that's literally, my friends. The Antichrist is not going to have any power over the church, but those left behind, woe be unto you. Verse 8 says, "All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of the life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world." This book belongs to the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. This book of life was known to Moses. Moses said, "God, if you won't forgive these people, then blot my name out of your book." It's described in Daniel's visions. We even see it in Daniel 12:11. And from the foundation, that refers to the book being written, not Jesus being slain. Jesus was slain in real time, but he wrote names in that book. This is not an argument for predetermination, Because the way the book of, despite every pastor who's ever led an altar call, he says, come on down, lift your hand, give your heart to Jesus, and your name will be written in the Lamb's book of life. That's not how it works. This is how good and gracious our God is. Every name is written in the book of life until you are found not covered by the blood of Christ. And then your name is blotted out. That means there's not a person on this planet that God isn't waiting to the last minute to say there's no hope. How cool is that? 1 Peter 1:19 through 20 proves it. It says, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, he indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. In Luke 10, verse 20, it says, nevertheless, do not rejoice that the spirits are subject to you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. And Revelation 3:5 says, he who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. In fact, the last chapter of the book which we are studying says, for I testify to everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to these things, God will add to him all the plagues that are written in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part from the book of life, from the holy city, and from the things which are written in this book. Revelation 13:9 through 10, that pause, it is a dire warning and is where we end this session. Again, 7 times outside of the 7 letters to the 7 churches, the book of Revelation says, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. What the heck does that mean? Here's the promise. This guy that thinks he is one bad mamma jamma, he's going to kill everybody. He's going to use the sword. He's going to crush the saints. He's going to set in the temple of the Most High God. The promise of God is he who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. The patience and faith of the saints of Revelation chapter 7 is, hold on, I'm coming. And as bad as he thinks he is, he ain't seen nothing yet. Let's take a break.